Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back to Holiday History. Tonight, I invite you to settle into a comfortable chair, or perhaps tuck yourself beneath a blanket as we drift together into the past. Imagine the soft creak of wood as the wind brushes against your windows, the faint glow of a lamp or candle nearby, and the slow quieting of the world outside. It is the perfect time for a bedtime story, one woven with threads of history, harvest, and the kind of frolicsome mischief that once marked the Halloween season in colonial America. Tonight's tale is called Husking Bees and Halloween Frolics. It is the story of how a night that we now associate with costumes, candy, and jack-o'-lanterns once unfolded very differently. It was a time when chores turned into festivals, when barns became dance halls, and when October's shadows carried not only ghost stories, but also the laughter of neighbours and the spark of young romances. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for something small. Down below, in the comments, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Are you in New England, where many of these traditions first took root among the rocky fields and crisp autumn air? Are you somewhere else in America, where the corn still whispers in the October breeze? Or perhaps you're halfway across the world, imagining what colonial autumn might have felt like centuries ago. I always love seeing where you're listening in from. It's like weaving a great big quilt out of stories and places, stitched together by your voices. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to Holiday History. Think of it as leaving a lantern in the window, so that whenever you wish to return to another cozy tale from the past, the light will be waiting for you. Now, with that little bit of housekeeping done, let's step into the old world together. Close your eyes if you like, or simply let the sound of my voice carry you back. Picture a countryside where the harvest season is drawing to its close. The days have shortened, and the air has a crisp, apple-sweet sharpness that makes each breath feel like a sip of cider. Smoke curls from chimneys, golden leaves crunch beneath boots, and in the distance you can hear the faint creak of wagon wheels bringing in the last loads of corn. The year is waning. The fields are nearly bare. The sun sets faster each evening, and people feel the weight of winter drawing near. Yet before the cold months begin, there is work to finish, and work in those times was rarely done in solitude. Families called upon neighbours, and neighbours upon friends. Together they gathered not only to lighten each other's burdens, but also to laugh, to share food and music, and to bring warmth into the darkening season. And so, on an October night, you might find yourself at a husking bee, a gathering where the labour of stripping husks from corn was transformed into a kind of festival. Lanterns would glow inside a great wooden barn, and the rustle of dried husks would mingle with the sound of fiddles, clapping hands, and bursts of laughter. But the husking bee was more than just work. It was also play. And it was more than just play. It was opportunity. For in the soft shadows of lantern light, amidst the mountains of husked corn, there was a chance for flirtation, for whispered secrets, for the mischievous games that made Halloween night something truly special. This is where we begin our story, in the golden haze of colonial autumn, when the land itself seemed to hold its breath between harvest and frost, and when Halloween was not yet the holiday of jack-o'-lanterns and candy, but instead a night of community, mischief, and sometimes romance. setting the stage, Colonial Autumn. To understand Halloween in colonial America, we first need to step into October itself, a season that shaped every thought and action of those who lived then. Today, October often means pumpkins on porches, children planning costumes, and candy tucked away in bowls. But for the colonists, October meant harvest and preparation. The season was not decorative, but decisive. It decided whether families would face winter with plenty or with want. Corn stood at the heart of it all. To us, it might be an autumn symbol carved on kitchen towels or sold in decorative bundles at the market. For colonial families, it was food, fodder, and security. Its kernels became bread, porridge, and seed. Its stalks became bedding and feed for livestock. Its husks, once stripped, lined baskets or served as kindling. Corn was not ornament. It was survival. And so, when the harvest was gathered, another task began, the husking. Each ear needed to be stripped of its papery shell, sorted, dried, and stored. Done alone, the task was crushing. Done together, it became bearable, even joyful. Thus the husking bee was born, a gathering where necessity met festivity. Picture the approach to such an evening. The sun slips below the hills, staining the sky a deep violet with streaks of copper along the horizon. A crisp wind stirs the last of the leaves along dirt lanes. Ahead, a barn door glows with lantern light, open wide to welcome neighbours. From inside comes the mingled sound of voices, laughter, and the faint scrape of a fiddle tuning its strings. Neighbours arrive on horseback or on foot, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the dusk. Greetings ripple through the yard. A clap on the shoulder, a warm embrace, a teasing word to a friend not seen in weeks. Inside, the barn smells of hay and earth, of smoke from the lanterns, and of cider simmering in a kettle. Children dart about, their shoes scuffing the straw. Elders claim the best seats along the walls. And in the centre lies the great pile of corn, waiting to be freed from its husks. The work begins in earnest. People settle onto stools and hay bales, reaching into the mound. Husks peel back with a dry, rustling sound that becomes the steady rhythm of the evening. Each ear is tossed into baskets with a dull, satisfying thump. The motion is repetitive, but in the company of friends, it feels less like labour and more like music, a harmony of hands moving together. As the pile shrinks, stories rise to fill the air. An elder might recall a harvest long ago when frost came too soon. A traveller might share tidings from a distant town. A young boy tells of hearing wolves near the edge of the woods, and everyone laughs, though they know the danger is real enough. The line between fact and folklore blurs easily in October. A rustle in the trees could be a deer, or it could be something less explainable. Every so often, laughter bursts louder than usual, for someone has found a red ear of corn. Tradition says that whoever finds one may claim a kiss. It is a light-hearted custom meant for teasing, but it carries weight too. The young glance at one another with anticipation, hoping for their chance. The elders chuckle knowingly, remembering their own youthful nights. A red ear might be rare, but the blushes it produced were not. Food punctuates the work. A tray of fried cakes makes its rounds, warm and sweet. Cups of cider are pressed into calloused hands. A pie is cut wide, as if generosity itself were baked into the crust. These offerings keep the circle moving, their comfort reminding everyone that work and pleasure are not so far apart. Music too plays its part. A fiddle or fife begins, sometimes joined by a clear voice singing a tune known to all. The rhythm sets the pace of the hands, the bow sliding across the strings in time with the tearing of husks. Feet tap, shoulders sway, and even as the pile of corn shrinks, the night grows larger, filled with sound and spirit. Outside, the October night presses close. Stars scatter thickly above. Frost glitters on fence posts, catching the lantern glow whenever the door opens. A dog curls in the straw just outside, keeping watch. From the woods an owl calls, its note deep and solemn, as though reminding the revellers that Halloween still belongs partly to the dark. Inside, though, the barn feels invincible against the night. Here is warmth, light and laughter. Here is the gathering of a community that knows the value of shared work. Husking bees were never only about corn, they were about connection. They reminded each person that no household was alone in its labour, nor in its joy. And as October deepened, the husking bee took on the flavour of Halloween. Mischief crept in at the edges, a gourd hollowed and lit with a candle, placed to startle a latecomer. A gate quietly unpinned and leaned against the wrong fence, to be discovered the next morning. These were not cruel tricks, but gentle reminders that the season itself carried a spirit of play. By the time the corn was husked and the baskets brimming, the work had melted into festivity. The barn became a hall of merriment, its rafters echoing with music and stamping feet. Young people danced, elders shared stories, and cider flowed freely. October had transformed necessity into celebration. This was Colonial autumn, a season where the harshness of winter loomed, but where laughter, food, and companionship offered warmth against the dark. Halloween, far from being a night of candy and costumes, was a chance to gather, to tease, to tell stories, and perhaps to steal a kiss beneath the lantern light. It is into this world of husking bees, frolics, and October mischief that our story now settles, as we follow the way labour blurred into festivity, and festivity blurred into something more mysterious, more playful, and sometimes more romantic. The husking bee was one of colonial America's most cherished traditions, a live-in balance between work and play, necessity and delight. It took what might have been a grinding, lonely chore and transformed it into a night of laughter, fellowship, and sometimes even romance. The night began long before the first husk was pulled. As twilight fell, neighbours made their way down narrow dirt paths, lanterns swinging, their light bobbing like fireflies in the October dark. Horses snorted plumes of breath into the frosty air. Children clutched their parents' hands, skipping with excitement. From afar, the barn glowed, golden light spilling from the open doors, promising warmth and welcome. Inside, the hosts had prepared carefully. Benches and stools were pulled close to the great heap of corn piled in the centre. Tin lanterns hung from beams, their cut-out stars and moons casting playful patterns on the walls. A kettle of cider simmered nearby, filling the space with its sweet, spiced aroma. Platters of bread and pie waited, covered with cloths to keep them warm. The barn was no longer just a place of work and storage. For one night, it was transformed into the heart of the community. When all had gathered, the husking began. Hands plunged into the pile, pulling out ears of corn with brisk, practiced motions. The husks crackled and tore, tossed aside into another heap, while the clean ears landed with satisfying thuds into baskets. The sound was constant, steady, a music of labour that filled the barn. Alone, the task could be numbing. Together, it became almost soothing, a rhythm underpinned by the hum of voices. Conversations threaded their way across the circle. A farmer recounted a harvest storm from years past. A young boy boasted of seeing strange lights in the fields, much to the amusement of the elders. News travelled as fast as hands could husk. Whose cow had calved, whose roof had blown loose, who had taken ill. Gossip, too, found its way in, who had been seen walking with whom, and whether a certain glance at last Sunday's meeting had meant what it seemed. The work was punctuated by food and drink. Mugs of hot cider were passed around, warming cold fingers. Fried cakes, sweet with molasses, disappeared almost as soon as they were set out. Thick wedges of pie were cut, shared without hesitation. To take food was to be part of the circle. To share food was to affirm the bond of neighbourliness. Even the simplest fare, bread, apples, cheese, tasted like feast when eaten together. Then came the moment everyone waited for, the discovery of a red ear of corn. Rare and striking, it carried with it a playful custom. Whoever found it was entitled to a kiss. Suddenly, the steady rhythm of husking halted, laughter bubbling up as the finder stood triumphant. What followed depended on the courage of the moment. A bold young man might stride straight across the circle to kiss the girl he favoured, to the teasing cheers of the crowd. A shy youth might hesitate, blushing fiercely as friends urged him on. Sometimes the finder would play the rogue, bestowing a kiss on an unsuspecting elder, provoking gales of laughter. And sometimes the red ear was slyly slipped to another, passing the choice along like a secret. Though framed as jest, the ritual carried a quiet weight. For the young, it was one of the few chances to show affection openly. A kiss at a husking bee could be remembered long after the husks were gone, whispered about for weeks afterward. It was a moment of daring, a spark of romance made safe by tradition. As the pile of corn dwindled, storytelling often took over. The barn, with its lantern light and shadowed rafters, became a theatre for the imagination. Tales of witches, wandering spirits, and ghostly lights stirred shivers and laughter alike. October was a month when the ordinary felt tinged with mystery, and Halloween all the more so. Children clung closer to their mothers, wide-eyed. Young men told the stories with relish, adding twists to make the girls gasp. The elders shook their heads but smiled, remembering their own youth. These stories gave shape to the darkness outside, reminding everyone that while the night was vast and uncertain, inside the barn they were safe together. At last, the great heap of corn was reduced to baskets of clean ears and piles of husks. But the night was far from over. The benches were pushed back, and the fiddler raised his bow. With the first notes of a jig, the barn was transformed once again, this time into a dance hall. Feet stamped the wooden floor, skirts swirled, and laughter rang out. Dances were simple reels and jigs, easy to learn, joyous to perform. Couples clasped hands, twirled and parted, only to find each other again in the next turn. Elders clapped along, their smiles as warm as the lanterns. The music was lively, but it was more than entertainment. It was release, joy born out of labour shared. Romance lingered here too. A stolen glance across the dance floor, a hand held a moment longer than the step required, a smile exchanged in the swirl of movement. For many young people, these were the only times when such closeness was possible. The husking bee was not just a harvest ritual, it was a courtship ground. The genius of the husking bee was its ability to balance life's demands. Work was necessary, but so was joy. Survival was harsh, but laughter made it bearable. The husking bee embodied that truth, reminding everyone that community could transform the burdens of life into opportunities for connection. By the end of the night, the barn smelled of cider and wood smoke, of husks and sweat, of pies and spiced bread. Children dozed against their parents. The music slowed to softer airs. Lanterns burned low, shadows deepened, and neighbours began to gather their cloaks. Outside, the October night was sharp and clear. Frost glimmered on fence posts and the stars stretched wide above. The walk home was long, but hearts were light. The work was finished, and winter would be easier because of it. More than that, though, each family carried with them the memory of laughter, of warmth, of kisses claimed and dances shared. The husking bee was more than a practical gathering. It was a ritual of identity, a way for communities to remind themselves of who they were. They were not solitary farmers, each family isolated in its own struggle. They were neighbours bound together, capable of turning hardship into celebration. And so, when we think of Halloween in colonial America, we must remember the husking bee, the barn filled with rustling husks, the rare thrill of the red ear, the music and laughter rising into the rafters. It was a night where work and play balanced perfectly, and where the cold hand of necessity was warmed by the fire of fellowship. If the husking bee gave colonists their harvest gatherings, then Halloween gave those nights their particular flavour, playful, mischievous, and touched with mystery. In colonial America, Halloween was not yet the costumed parade of candy and carved pumpkins that we know today, but neither was it only the solemn vigil of saints and spirits remembered from the old world. Instead, it was something in between, a time when neighbours gathered not only to work and feast, but to play, to prank, and to test the boundaries between the ordinary and the uncanny. The settlers who carried Halloween across the Atlantic brought with them fragments of older traditions. From Celtic Samhain came the notion that autumn nights were liminal, thresholds when the world of the living brushed against the world of the dead. From England came harvest customs, bonfires, mischief, and gatherings for food and storytelling. In Scotland and Ireland, there were tales of divination games and masks to confuse wandering spirits. But the New World reshaped these customs. Colonial America was a place of wide fields and long winters, where survival demanded hard work, and where community ties mattered more than ritual exactness. Halloween could not be kept exactly as it was in Europe. It had to adapt. What emerged was a holiday less about warding off spirits and more about embracing fellowship, play, and the shared thrill of mischief. One of the most characteristic features of colonial Halloween was mischief. The kind performed was rarely cruel. Instead, it carried the sly humour of neighbours teasing neighbours. Boys might slip the wheels from a wagon and leave it balanced carefully on a barn roof. Or they might quietly rearrange fence gates so that livestock were found wandering in the wrong pens come morning. Sometimes gourds or turnips were hollowed, crudely carved with faces and lit with candles inside. These lanterns glowed eerily in the fields, startling those who passed. On dark October nights, a flickering grin at the roadside could make even the bravest quicken their pace. Though we think of the jack-o'-lantern as a 19th century pumpkin tradition, its roots lay in these earlier tricks. A colonial adaptation of the old world's ghost lights meant to spook and amuse in equal measure. Children played smaller pranks, tying strings to doors and tugging them from the shadows, or scattering corn kernels across a neighbour's step so that they skittered noisily underfoot. These tricks were expected, even welcomed. To be the target of Halloween mischief was to be included in the community's play, a reminder that one was part of the fabric of neighbours. The husking bee and Halloween overlapped naturally. By late October, corn husking was in full swing, and the gatherings lent themselves easily to frolic. Once the work was done, Halloween added its particular atmosphere. The flicker of lanterns felt spookier on that night. The stories told seemed to lean more toward the eerie. The laughter rang sharper, touched with the thrill of daring. Inside the barn, the shadows seemed deeper, the rafters higher, the music livelier. Young men might slip outside to hang a carved lantern in the lane, then return with innocent faces as the next group arrived shrieking. Girls might cluster together, whispering about strange happenings on the road. A traveller who swore he saw a ghostly woman at a crossroads, or an animal behaving in some uncanny way. It was all part of the charm. Halloween took what was ordinary, a night of husking and dancing, and stretched it thin enough to let the extraordinary shine through. Halloween was above all a night for stories. After the husking was done, and before the dancing began in earnest, groups would gather close around a fire or a cluster of lanterns. Here the oldest tales were told, of spirits wandering the earth, of witches meeting in secret, of omens seen in the sky. These stories were not always believed, but they were always savoured. An elder might tell of hearing footsteps on a lonely road, though no one was there. A girl might whisper that she had dreamed of a face she did not know, only to meet the stranger weeks later. A boy might describe lights moving in the fields at midnight, bobbing and weaving like lanterns with no hands to carry them. The barn gave shape to these stories, its beams looming like ribs, its shadows thick and uncertain. The audience gasped and shivered, then laughed at their own fright. In the safety of numbers, fear became pleasure. The darker the tale, the warmer the cider tasted afterward. Halloween also carried an air of romance. In Europe, October nights had long been associated with fortune-telling games for love. In colonial America, these traditions softened and adapted, but the spirit remained. A husking bee on Halloween gave young people excuses to steal glances, to test boldness, to edge closer in the swirl of a dance. A kiss won with a red ear of corn carried extra weight on Halloween night, whispered about for weeks after. A dance begun in mischief might end in earnest affection. Even the pranks had courtship hidden inside them. A lantern placed to startle a girl might lead to laughter shared, to a conversation afterward, to a memory neither forgot. Halloween, with its mixture of daring and play, offered opportunities for romance that everyday life rarely allowed. It gave license to boldness, to laughter, to gestures that might otherwise have been forbidden. But beyond mischief and romance, Halloween served the broader purpose of binding communities together. To prank a neighbour was to claim them as part of the circle. To share food in the barn was to affirm ties of fellowship. To tell stories together was to create a shared memory, one that would be recalled in winters to come. In an age when survival depended on cooperation, such rituals mattered deeply. They reminded each household that it was not alone. They turned fear of the dark into laughter. They turned necessity into joy. And so Halloween, in colonial America, was not primarily about spirits or saints, nor about costumes or candy. It was about neighbors. It was about the balance of work and play, of caution and daring, of shadows and light. When the dancing slowed, when the cider jugs were emptied, when the lanterns burned low, neighbors gathered their cloaks and prepared for the walk home. Outside, the October night stretched wide and silent. Frost glittered on the grass. The stars wheeled above in countless numbers. Somewhere an owl hooted, solemn and slow. The walk back along the lanes was quieter than the arrival. Laughter faded into murmurs. Footsteps softened on the dirt. Yet each family carried with them the warmth of the barn, the memory of stories and pranks, the comfort of shared food and music. For the young, perhaps there was a quickened heartbeat, a hand held in the dance, a glance returned, a kiss claimed with a red ear of corn. For the old, there was satisfaction, the work done, the community strong, the season marked with joy. And in the morning, when someone found their gate missing or their wagon gently overturned, there was laughter again. Halloween's mischief carried no malice. It was a reminder of the night just past, a sign that the village was bound not just by labour, but by laughter. To look back on colonial Halloween is to see a holiday in the making. Its old-world roots of fire and spirits had crossed the sea, but here they grew into something more communal, more playful, more centred on fellowship. The husking bee gave structure. Halloween gave atmosphere. Together they created a night when work turned to joy, when mischief warmed rather than harmed, when romance bloomed under the lantern light. Colonial Halloween was not a holiday of costumes or candy. It was a holiday of neighbours. A night when barns rang with fiddles, when cider steamed in mugs, when shadows played across the walls, and stories curled into the rafters. A night when laughter rose against the encroaching dark of winter, and when the simple act of gathering became an act of celebration. Once the corn was husked and the baskets stacked neatly, the night never ended in silence. That was only the beginning. The barn that had served as a place of labour transformed into a theatre of laughter, tricks, and quiet sparks of affection. These were the Frolics, simple games fashioned from corn husks, lanterns, cider, and imagination. They gave Halloween in colonial America its unique flavour, turning work into merriment and companionship into something deeper. Corn husks, light and papery, seemed made for play once the serious work was finished. Fingers nimble from hours of stripping husks began weaving them into small tokens. Rings, bracelets, knotted charms, or even little dolls. They were clumsy sometimes, a bit ragged at the edges, but their meaning was never lost. The fun was in slipping them unseen into someone's pocket or apron. A girl might reach into her shawl later and find a husk ring folded there. A boy might pull out his kerchief and discover a little husk doll staring back at him. It was a secret note written in the language of the harvest. Teasing quickly followed. "Who left it there?" friends would cry, laughing and nudging, demanding answers. Sometimes the admirer confessed with a grin. Sometimes they let the mystery linger, stretching the thrill across days or weeks. More than one young couple later told their children that their first true notice of one another had come in the form of a husk charm, discovered at a Halloween frolic. Mischief, too, belonged to the season. Hollowed gourds and turnips, carved with crude faces and lit from within, became the tools of harmless fright. Set along a lane or hidden in a hayloft, they startled those who stumbled upon their grinning, flickering faces. But the trick did not end there. Out of these glowing heads grew a favourite game, Jack's Chase. One daring youth carried the lantern and dashed into the night, weaving between fences and trees. Behind him came the chase, boys and girls alike shrieking with laughter as the light darted ahead, vanishing and reappearing in the dark. The rules were simple. Catch the lantern bearer, and you won. Yet the chase was never about winning. It was about the breathless laughter, the stumble over roots, the sharp October air in the lungs, the sudden closeness when two runners collided in the dark. The lantern's glow bobbing ahead looked like a will-o'-the-wisp, leading them deeper into the game, deeper into the magic of Halloween night. Back inside, where cider steamed and firelight glowed, games of wit took their turn. Riddles were posed, and each person had to answer. Those who failed paid a forfeit. Some riddles were clever. What has ears but cannot hear? A cornfield. Others were silly, designed to trip the listener. Laughter came as much from the failures as from the successes. The forfeits varied, and the crowd delighted in inventing them. One person might be told to sing a verse of a hymn off-key. Another might be dared to dance alone in the centre of the barn. A shy youth might be asked to declare aloud the name of the one they admired, to blush and stammer, while friends clapped and teased. And often, the most coveted forfeit of all, a kiss, freely given or cheekily stolen, to the roar of approving laughter. These riddles and forfeits were a way of loosening tongues and brightening spirits. They tested wit, courage, and boldness, all under the forgiving warmth of the fire. Another game belonged entirely to the husking barn, the whispered path. Neighbours arranged themselves in a winding line, and a message was whispered from one end to the other, ear to ear. The delight was in the transformation. The frost has come early might twist into the horse has gone surly. Past the cider jug might emerge as lass beside the jug. The sillier the change, the greater the laughter when the original and final phrases were compared. Yet the game held a second pleasure, unspoken but well known. Whispers meant closeness, a cheek bent near another's ear, a hand steadying a shoulder, the soft tickle of breath against skin. In the dim lantern light, these small touches carried a thrill. The barn rang with laughter, but beneath it, hearts fluttered with something gentler. Shadow play was another favourite. A white sheet was hung across one side of the barn, with a candle or lantern behind it. One by one, participants walked behind the sheet, casting their silhouettes for the others to guess. The shapes could be comical. A man miming his own ox with exaggerated plodding. A girl pretending to churn butter only to spill it dramatically. Or they could be mysterious. A figure blowing a kiss, or two shadows joining hands. Guessing who was who became harder when disguises were added. A shawl pulled over the head, a coat swung like a cape. The barn echoed with laughter as guesses flew. Yet sometimes the laughter quieted into murmurs when a gesture seemed more tender, more pointed than mere play. The shadows themselves, flickering larger than life, seemed to hint at secrets that lantern light could not reveal. No Halloween frolic was complete without cider. And sometimes the drink itself became the game. A jug was passed around the circle, each person taking a sip before declaring a fortune for someone else. The fortunes were usually playful. You'll marry before the next harvest. Your cow will give twins next spring. You'll spill this jug and bring bad luck. Sometimes, though, the fortunes took on a sharper edge of romance. You'll dance with your sweetheart before the night is over. You'll sit beside someone who keeps glancing your way. Such words, though spoken in jest, made cheeks flush and eyes sparkle. The cider jug, passed hand to hand, bound the circle together. Each sip, each fortune, was a thread weaving the group into a tapestry of laughter and possibility. Romance threaded through all these games, though rarely in obvious ways. A husk charm tucked into a pocket, a lantern chase through the fields, a whisper that lingered too long, a fortune spoken aloud. These were the gentle signals of affection, in a world where courtship was usually restrained. The elders smiled at these antics, remembering their own youth. Children laughed without yet understanding. But the young, caught in the middle, felt their hearts quicken. For them, the frolics were more than play. They were rehearsal for futures they dared to dream. To modern eyes, these games may seem simple, yet for colonial communities they were profound. They provided safe spaces for laughter, for flirtation, for courage disguised as play. They turned a barn into a theatre, a cider jug into an oracle, a husk charm into a love letter. Halloween gave permission for these frolics. It was the night when shadows deepened, when rules bent, when laughter carried further into the cold. It was the night when communities could remind themselves that life was not only survival, but joy. As the games wound down, the barn grew quieter. The cider jug was light, the pies long gone, the lanterns dim. Riddles gave way to yawns, whispers to farewells. The sheet was folded, the husks swept aside. Neighbours pulled on cloaks and stepped into the sharp October night. The stars were wide and bright, the frost silvering the ground. Yet each carried home warmth, the laughter of the frolics, the mischief of the lantern chase, the memory of shadows and whispers. And some carried more, a husk charm in a pocket, a kiss claimed in jest, a fortune from the cider jug that felt more like truth than play. Halloween frolics were the heartbeat of colonial October, playful, inventive, and deeply human. They turned barns into playgrounds, work into laughter, and shadows into romance. In their echoes, one hears not only the rustle of husks, but the voices of neighbours bound by joy. To speak of husking bees and Halloween frolics only as nights of work and play is to miss their deepest meaning. Beneath the laughter and the games lay something more enduring. A community weaving itself together, strand by strand, into a fabric strong enough to withstand the hardships of colonial life. These gatherings were not luxuries. They were lifelines. Colonial America was a land of distance. Families often lived miles apart, their homes separated by fields, woods, and streams. The daily round of farm life left little time for travel, and weeks might pass without seeing a neighbour. Winter only deepened that isolation, cutting off roads with snow, pressing families close around their hearths. In such a world, the chance to gather was precious. A husking bee was not only about the corn, it was about seeing familiar faces, sharing burdens, and reminding one another that no household was truly alone. When families arrived at the barn, they brought with them more than hands for labour. They brought presents, comfort, and connection. The heart of any community is its stories, and the husking bee gave space for them to be told. Around the pile of corn, voices rose and wove together, creating a living tapestry of memory. A man might recall the first time he'd planted corn on rocky soil, the sweat it had cost him, and the pride of watching it grow. An older woman might tell of a winter when the harvest had failed, when neighbours had shared from their own stores so no one starved. A traveller might bring tidings from faraway towns, connecting the barn to the wider world. These stories did more than entertain. They carried lessons, warnings, and encouragement. They preserved the past and passed it to the next generation. Children husking alongside their parents learned not only how to peel a husk, but how their people had endured, adapted, and thrived. If stories carried memory, laughter carried resilience. Colonial life was difficult, often relentless in its demands. Work filled the daylight hours, and worry filled the nights. But in the barn, with neighbours gathered close, laughter broke the weight of that labour. It came in many forms. A joke told by a fiddler between tunes, a riddle gone wrong in the forfeit game, a lantern chase that ended in someone tumbling harmlessly into the hay. Even the discovery of a red ear of corn, with its blush of romance, sent laughter ringing through the rafters. That laughter mattered. It lightened the burdens carried in silently all year. It reminded each person that joy was not only possible, but essential. And when winter pressed in, memories of those moments, the sound of a friend's voice, the sight of a neighbour doubled over with mirth, offered warmth against the cold. For the elders, these gatherings carried a different kind of significance. They were reminders that their wisdom and presence still mattered. In a society that prized youth for labour, age was honoured for memory. At the husking bee, elders sat in central seats, their hands husking more slowly but still steady. They told the old stories, sang the old songs, and sometimes cast the deciding word in a riddle or game. Their presence anchored the gathering, a living link to the generations before. Young people listened, laughed, and learned. They inherited not just land and tools, but traditions, jokes, and tales that made sense of the world. The husking bee was thus an engine of continuity, ensuring that memory did not fade even as seasons changed. The social role of the Frolics cannot be overstated. For young men and women, the husking bee was one of the few sanctioned spaces to mingle. Courtship was watched carefully in colonial communities. But here, under the cover of tradition and the approval of neighbours, affection could bloom in plain sight. A husk charm slipped into an apron, a whispered phrase along the husking line, a hand clasped in the dance. Each gesture was small, but together they formed the courtships that built families, and the families that built communities. Romance was not the only bond strengthened. Friendships deepened too. To sit beside a neighbour and share husks was to share part of a life. To chase a lantern through the fields was to be young together. To swap riddles and laughter was to carry the same memories home. These threads bound the community into a net strong enough to catch even the hardest years. Colonial life was steeped in religion, yet Halloween Frolics revealed a gentler balance between faith and folklore. Ministers might warn against superstition, yet even the most pious families joined the gatherings. The laughter and fellowship did not feel sinful. They felt necessary. Stories of witches and spirits were told with relish, not to undermine faith, but to enrich it with wonder. Fortune-telling games and whispered prophecies were indulged not as doctrine, but as play. It was understood that people needed such tales, not as belief, but as relief. Thus the husking bee and the Halloween frolic stood at the intersection of the sacred and the playful. They were not acts of rebellion against faith, but reminders that a community is sustained not only by prayer and labour, but also by joy, laughter, and imagination. The true meaning of these nights revealed itself in winter. When snow lay heavy on the ground and roads vanished beneath drifts, families remembered the barn. They remembered the laughter, the cider, the games, the warmth of neighbours close by. In times of need, those bonds mattered. A family who had shared in the husking bee was more likely to share from their stores. A youth who had laughed in the lantern chase would be quick to lend a hand in a storm. The memory of connection, made tangible in the frolic, became a promise carried forward. It is no coincidence that the barn was the setting for these gatherings. The barn was more than a building. It was a symbol of survival. It sheltered not only animals and harvest, but also the hopes of a community. To light it with lanterns, to fill it with laughter and music, was to declare that life could be abundant even in a world that demanded constant toil. The barn's beams absorbed those voices. Its rafters held the echoes. Year after year, season after season, the barn became a vessel of memory. To step into it was to step into the stories of those who had husked before, danced before, laughed before. In the end, husking bees and Halloween frolics were not only about corn or cider or mischief. They were about people, about weaving a scattered, struggling collection of households into a true community. They were about reminding one another that joy was not a luxury, but a necessity. Each husk stripped was a gesture of fellowship. Each game played was a stitch in the fabric of belonging. Each laugh shared was a lantern against the dark. So when we look back on colonial Halloween, let us not see only pranks or husks or dances. Let us see the deeper truth, that in barns lit by lantern light, communities learned how to be strong together. And in that strength, they found not only survival, but joy. Every tradition leaves footprints, and the husking bees and frolics of colonial America left theirs stamped deep into the soil of the holiday we know today. Though the form of Halloween changed over the centuries, growing from humble barns to grand parlour parties, from whispered fortunes to children in costumes, the essence of fellowship, mischief, and play remained. As America shifted from a scattered rural society to a more settled town-centred one, the husking bee began to fade. By the mid-19th century, mechanized farming, and new methods of processing corn reduced the need for large gatherings. What once had been essential labour gradually became memory. Yet the spirit of the husking bee did not vanish. It migrated. Instead of barns filled with corn, families opened their parlours and kitchens. There, neighbours still gathered on October nights for cider, cakes, and games. The setting had changed, but the purpose was the same: to turn the season of dwindling light into one of warmth, companionship, and laughter. The parlour Halloween party, so common in the Victorian era, can be traced directly back to those husking nights. The laughter around riddles, the daring in courtship games, the thrill of telling ghost stories by firelight, all these carried forward, adapted to new surroundings. The husks might be gone, but the echoes of rustling corn still whispered in the games played by lamplight. The mischief of colonial Halloween also endured. Boys no longer balanced wagons on rooftops or switched farm gates, but their younger descendants found new tricks. Removing garden gates in town, overturning outhouses, or scribbling chalk messages on fences. These tricks, like the lantern pranks before them, were rarely destructive in intent. They were reminders of the season, playful marks of inclusion in a shared tradition. A household targeted by a prank was not being excluded but embraced. We thought of you. We remembered you. In time, this mischief softened further. By the early 20th century, with communities less tolerant of damage, children were offered alternatives. The cry of trick or treat that rose in American neighborhoods was a natural outgrowth of the colonial impulse to prank and tease, balanced by the offer of food and goodwill. What began with lantern chases in fields ended with children in costumes on doorsteps, their bags open for candy. Perhaps the strongest legacy of the colonial frolics lies in their games of romance and fortune. The red ear of corn, the whispered path, the cider jug predictions. All these spoke to a hunger for glimpses of the future, particularly of love. When Halloween moved into parlours, these games survived in new forms. Victorians loved fortune-telling, and October 31st became a night for it. Instead of husks, they used nuts or apples. Instead of cider jugs, they used mirrors and candles. But the impulse was the same: to use the uncanny night as an excuse to flirt, to dream, to imagine what might lie ahead. Even today, echoes of those games linger. Bobbing for apples, though you've already covered it in past stories, is nothing more than a descendant of those playful contests, a test of daring, wit and romance, disguised as amusement. The husking bee's courtship dances still hum beneath the surface of Halloween gatherings, reminding us that October has long been a season of hearts as well as haunts. The ghost stories told in barns did not vanish either. They grew. By the 19th century, America was hungry for tales of the uncanny, and Halloween provided the perfect stage. Writers like Washington Irving and later Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe tapped into the same desire that had once made colonial children huddle close in husking barns: the thrill of being safely frightened. Today, the telling of ghost stories around Halloween, in books, films, or whispered at sleepovers, still carries the DNA of those colonial nights. The lanterns may be brighter, the shadows electric rather than candle-lit, but the impulse remains the same: to face the dark together, to laugh at what frightens us, and to draw warmth from shared fear. More than any single tradition, the greatest legacy of colonial Halloween was its role as a social holiday. In a time when community was survival, Halloween proved that joy could be as binding as duty. Work was necessary, faith was vital, but fellowship was the glue that held it all together. As America grew and changed, that lesson endured. Halloween parties in parlours, then in schools and community halls, carried forward the idea that October was not a month for solitude, but for gathering. Even trick-or-treating, though vastly different in form, is still about connection. Neighbours opening doors to one another, sharing in a ritual of inclusion. The husking bee may be gone, but its spirit lives each time people come together in laughter on Halloween night. By the late 19th century, Halloween had transformed into something recognizably modern. Pumpkins replaced turnips as lanterns, costumes were introduced, and games grew more theatrical. Yet beneath these layers, the old bones of colonial Halloween remained. The mischief, the games of courtship, the storytelling, the gathering of neighbours. All these threads stretched unbroken from barns lit by lanterns to porches lined with jack-o'-lanterns. Halloween was reborn, not as a rejection of the old ways, but as their continuation in new soil. Looking back, the husking bee and the colonial frolics remind us that holidays are never static. They bend and reshape themselves, carrying forward what matters most. For Halloween, what mattered was not the husks or the cider, not even the pranks or the shadows, but the fellowship they represented. Colonial Halloween showed that laughter could make work light, that mischief could knit neighbours closer, that even in the shadow of winter, joy could be kindled. That spirit has survived every transformation. Whether in barns, parlours, or city streets, Halloween remains a holiday of gathering, of play, of community. So when we light our jack-o'-lanterns, share candy with neighbours, or tell ghost stories by the glow of a screen, we are, without always realising it, echoing those nights of long ago. The barns may be quieter now, the husks gone, but the legacy of colonial Halloween still rustles faintly, like dry leaves on an autumn wind. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey through husking bees and Halloween frolics. We have stepped into barns lit by lantern glow, listened to the rustle of husks in eager hands, and laughed with neighbours as riddles twisted and lanterns bobbed in the October night. We have seen how the simple work of husking corn became something greater. A night of laughter, of mischief, of whispered romance, and of connection strong enough to last the winter. These gatherings remind us that holidays are not only about what we do, but about who we do them with. A husk charm slipped into a pocket, a red ear of corn that won a kiss, a lantern glowing like a ghost light in the fields. These were the details, but the true heart was fellowship. Colonial Halloween was less about spirits of the other world, and more about the spirit of neighbours, bound by joy as surely as by need. Think of how those barns must have sounded. The fiddler's bow scraping a lively tune, feet stamping in reels on wooden floors, children giggling in corners, elders telling stories of winters past, the rustle of husks, the warmth of cider, the occasional shriek of laughter when a prank landed just right. That chorus, half work, half play, was the music of a community reminding itself that even in hardship there could be sweetness. The legacy of those nights has lingered. Today we no longer gather to husk corn, yet we still gather. We carve pumpkins, we share candy, we tell ghost stories, we light candles against the autumn dark. And whether we realize it or not, we are echoing the voices of those barns. The costumes and candy may be new, but the laughter, the mischief, the togetherness, those are old, older than we often remember. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself there, seated on a hay bale, husks crackling in your hands, the lanterns casting golden circles on the wooden walls. Around you, neighbours laugh and tease, a fiddle strikes up a reel, and the cold October night presses gently against the doors. Inside, you are warm, welcomed, and part of something larger than yourself. The games are finished now. The cider jug is empty, the pie's eaten. Children nod against their mother's shoulders, and the music softens into slower airs. Lanterns dim, shadows deepen, and one by one, neighbours gather their cloaks and step into the frosty night. You too can linger in the barn a moment longer, breathing the mingled scents of husks and cider, before following them out beneath a sky full of stars. Halloween has always been, at its heart, a holiday of gathering. And though centuries have passed since those colonial nights, the need is the same. We gather to laugh, to share, to ease our burdens, and to remind ourselves that the darkness outside is never stronger than the light we create together. So, as you close your eyes, carry that thought with you, that you are part of a long tradition of October nights, when neighbours leaned close, when laughter echoed in barns, when joy was as vital as bread. Rest well, and let the lanterns of the past guide you gently into dreams. And when you wake, perhaps you'll carry a little of that warmth with you, into your own gatherings, your own celebrations, your own October nights. Good night, dear listener. May the echoes of husking bees and Halloween frolics keep you company, like a soft rustle of husks on the wind as you drift into sleep.